The speech by saying that I'd like to thank that nothing that I will be saying over the course of this speech is in any way a direct attack upon the souls of our opponents. That is to say that they have succeeded in convincing me, and I believe convincing my partner, that they honestly believe what they are saying. Unfortunately, believing in it is not enough, and it is for that same reason that you will not be voting for them today. Also, you might notice that we're not judging them on the premises of their souls, but simply upon their actions and upon their specific words, which is why, over the course of this speech, I'll be mainly just going down the flow and explaining the different ways in which they're at fault and correcting some of the errors in their language, without, however, passing judgment upon them as being racist. Because what we will be establishing over the course of this speech is that racism, that term, racist, is a much dirtier word than any ethnic slur that you can think of. Whenever we accuse someone of doing that, when we point the finger, we almost certainly, usually, maybe 99% of the time, have three more pointing right back at us. So it would, rather than just throwing mud back and forth at one another like chimpanzees about trying to decide, well, who is actually racist, let's actually say, I'm not going to accuse them of being racist, because that only says something about me, and I don't have the necessary psychological warrants to do that. Going on, there was never the institution of white supremacy. White supremacy was a concept specifically designed by the Nazis in the first half of the 20th century. This was rooted in the ideas of George Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel, who also influenced Marx and who also influenced Martin Luther King. Adolf Hitler was convinced that Hegel was right about the master and slave dialectic, and he was convinced that the master race, which was the Jews, should have to be subverted and turned into the slave race. But ultimately, since he knew that that would mean that the slave race of the Germans has to rise up against Jewish privilege, as we might say, he understood that, well, there's a risk that the Jews might retaliate by the same moral principle. So his alternative was obviously the final solution: let's just do genocide. Basically, I have to say, first of all, that as a person who is Russian, Jewish, and German, I'm thankful to be sitting in this room today, because I don't have to go so far as Greece in order to be, let's say, elevated to the degree of one of the world rulers, because of my Judaic heritage. No, I can be elevated to that same degree of privilege that the neo-Nazis in Greece would do, because I am white. And I think that this is the crux of why you will be voting for them today, because everything that they've said only reflects a fundamental superstitious attitude towards white people, which by their own criteria would be described as racist, and by our criteria will be described as naive, unintellectual, unhistorical, and hypocritical and fascistic. As Winston Churchill noted, fascism would come to the United States under the guise of anti-fascism, and although they claim to be crusading against this problem, all that they can hope to crusade against is their own prejudices, because there is never ever any evidence, as evidenced by the phenomenological work of Gertrude Stein and the most contemporary psychology, there's never any evidence that we have that someone whom we've never been in direct relationship with is racist. That you can't evidence what is going on in that person's mind and compare it empathically to your own mind unless you're in direct relation with that person. And even then, you are morally obligated to question everything that people tell you about that other person. And so, even if I experience you as being racist, that's only applies to my relationship to you. I can't expect people to believe that, and I shouldn't have to hold that grudge if I know myself to be right. The very fact they're pretending that it's absolutely ubiquitous that they are right, that there is this thing called white supremacy, which was a goal, which was a projection of an ideal future based also in the work of Hegel, which was never actually realized, but was popularized as an idea and made it to look as though that was actually the nature of the historical narrative, in the same way as the Nazis tried to oppress the Jewish people by making it look like Jewish supremacy was a thing. In that same way, there is no objective criteria for voting for this frankly fascistic ideology. Now let's go down the flow. The comparison of Ferguson and Gaza in this context is obviously a joke. First of all, Gaza is a perfect example of how a group of people who have been systematically oppressed can themselves in turn, in the words of Camus, demand a crown. Israel is using genocide against Palestine, but this has nothing to do with Ferguson. We know that the criterion for the Gaza conflict is actually over the fact that Israel decided it was really cool to build a giant wall under the Holy Land that was supposed to have been promised to not just one of the three Abrahamic religions, all three of them. As for Ferguson, Ferguson was literally one person and one other person and a whole lot of media telling us that this situation was influenced by something that we could all relate to, and that's racism. No, I'm sorry, but I choose to opt out of this, and as a Jew myself, I think that I have the authority to say something, not that that should grant me any special entitlement or privilege. And you can make of that as you will. Obviously, Obviously, I'm dispossessing myself of the notion that I'm white privileged. I'm also dispossessing myself by the exact same token of the notion of Jewish privilege. Neither should we marginalize people by placing them in the master group. Neither should we try so desperately to elevate people in what we call the slave group that they can actually become the very oppressors that we're talking about. Going on to the erasure of white supremacy. So you can basically do a direct turn here for the same principles that we've described. They're talking about intersectionality, they're talking about effectiveness, and the notion of Ferguson. And they're talking about genealogy and how how history has been erased. And we're arguing, yes, that is exactly what they're doing. They have not provided any historical warrants for where the concept of white supremacy came from, nor where white supremacy came from. So you can't believe that it existed before the concept because they provide no warrants for it, and they're not even being transparent about where the concept itself originates. So how do you link this concept to this thing? You have only to rely upon your personal prejudices, and that would be inviting judge intervention. Now, let's look at the instance of reparations. Reparations are terrible. Well, all that reparations is a sense of entitlement to a sort of possession. We don't think that possession is good, which is why we choose to identify as Marxist. Possession is exactly what creates the situation in Gaza, because the Jews are like, no, they promised us the Holy Land. We're the ones entitled to it. We're the ones entitled to this reparation. That's very funny. The misrepresentation of how we call Zach racist, that's a strawman fallacy. As for the concept about whiteness and how black people are described as being white, okay, so okay, that's 8 minutes. Can do a bit better than that. Racially motivated self-hatred. They're advocating for racially motivated self-hatred because their plan only solves for black bodies and brown bodies and does not solve for white bodies, and yet it pushes for this trichotomy. So that means that someone's getting left out, someone is being made to feel the scapegoat. And as someone who's actually been in a scapegoat situation before, I can't advocate for this. I know with objective certainty that there is no such thing as racism, because accusing someone of being racist is passing a judgment upon that person's soul. And that is something that thankfully many of us haven't had to suffer with. So if you vote for the existence of racism, you're voting from a position of privilege. Going on about how the guilty are charged until proven innocent, okay, they provide no warrants for this, so I'm going to provide one for them. Just to be generous, Franz Kafka's The Trial was written. Franz Kafka was an Austrian Jew, a European Jew, who did not have the necessary melanin, I think, to qualify by many definitions of being black, but I guess this makes him black, doesn't it? As for, they talk about Latinos, they talk about individuals. So, and finally, the whole notion of repaying debts, If you want to be born to feel indebted to someone, great. Advocate for the slave trade. Many people were born into slavery because over the course of human history, and not just in the United States, but outside the United States, right, we're trying to move out of the American-centric framework. Many people were born into it because of the debts of their family. If you are arguing that the past must determine the present, then you will always be doomed to repeat it. Studying history is not meant to say we owe ourselves to history. That is committing the same kind of naturalist fallacy that says, I'm not supposed to be here because I'm not native. It's the same kind of mentality that is the reason why Donald Trump is offering building a big wall to keep a lot of people out who are immigrants, much like myself, because we all know that manifest destiny is corrupt, and if some people are here, and that's definitely their land, and first come, first serve, and no one else gets to deserve to be there, regardless of the advances in science and technology and philosophy and literature and culture and civilization and democratic society that you're using right now, that would seemingly entitle them. The whole notion of Americanization being narcissistic, okay, again, they don't have the necessary epistemological framework to know that someone is being narcissistic. They only have the people available in this room. As for the fact that you were excluded, I'm sorry, I don't remember you self-identifying as brown. I thought that we were... So we can use that as a criterion because you never self-identified as brown. How can you expect us to know how you self-identify? It's ridiculous to us. But now that you've established that, the whole notion of white privilege existing, that's a bold statement to make if you're not white. Like, how do you know that the people oppressing you are oppressing you from a position of privilege? Maybe they're just oppressing you because they're assholes. Maybe you're being an asshole and that's why they're oppressing you. I don't understand how you can use this mythological explanation for what is an incredibly intricate human situation, I'm sure. And the whole notion of American exceptionalism, okay, that's also another turn because you've only resorted to an American conception of race. Because you've never provided any warrants for how you even define what a race is, we are only left as Americans to our own cultural presuppositions and our personal presuppositions. And you don't even acknowledge that this can't be an objective quality because it conflicts with other popularly held presuppositions from another culture.